evening and welcome to tonight's Undaunted, bringing you to the news on Touch Stories. I am Oyi Okbala. Let's begin. On the 11th of February, as the nation marked its Youth Day with official ceremonies and so-called patriotic song, a different silence settled across the hills and valleys of Ambazonia, from the dense forests of Manyu in the southwest to the rolling highlands of Dunga Manchun in the northwest. Towns awoke not to celebration, but to stillness. Streets lay hushed. Shop doors remained shut and classrooms stood empty, an echoing testament to a boycott that spoke louder in absence than in noise. What unfolded was just another chapter in the long and troubled story of a land divided by competing versions of identity and sovereignty in marketplaces, where bargaining voices usually rise with the morning sun. There was only the shuffle of cautious footsteps. In schoolyards, where laughter once carried on the wind, gates stayed locked. The ghost town was not merely an act of withdrawal, but a quiet assertion, an expression of unresolved tension that have lingered for nearly a decade. Yet, even within the stillness, there were variations. In some urban corners, life flickered cautiously, unshaped by security presence and local realities across the territory. The day revealed once again a landscape suspended between two narratives, one calling for independence, the other insisting on unity, while ordinary lives continue to navigate the fragile space in between. All these and more we'll talk on tonight's Undaunted, but first, let's get the prime headlines. Tonight on Undaunted, we'll get into the Atong Ignatius, who was killed in Kedjom, Ketinguh by his abductors after family failed to raise 5 million CFA ransom on time. Tonight, Ambazonian observers locked down as Youth Day celebrations are boycotted. We would also give you reports as widespread observance reported in February 11th lockdown across Ambazonia. Also tonight, SDF accuses CPDM elite of colluding with armed groups to rig 2025 presidential election. On the African scene, Zimbabwe erupts over cabinet move to extend Mnangagwa's rule to 2030. On the global scene, WHO presses the US to share COVID-19 origins intelligence after withdrawal in Geneva. Now let's get the news in full briefings. Atong Ignatius, a native of Kedjom, Ketinguh, who lived in Boya, was abducted, tortured, and killed by armed men. Achandu had returned home to attend his aunt's burial in Sabgar, locality within Kedjom, Ketinguh, who was kidnapped on Friday, 6 February 2026, while returning from a funeral. His abductors demanded a ransom of 5 million CFA before the family could mobilize the funds. Achandu, who was tortured and killed, his body was dumped on the night of February. On the night of Sunday, the 8th of February 2026, at a public square in Bo. Achandu's killing is not an isolated case. Over the past 2 years, there has been repeated cases of kidnappings, ransom, extortion, torture, and executions across Kedjom, Ketinguh, Bemising, and neighboring communities. Yet, despite all this, there has been no sustained or publicly communicated security action to get on this network. Many believe these kidnappers have direct collaboration with the French Cameroon authorities and the French Cameroon military. Tonight, let's get into Ambazonia, where Ambazonians observed lockdown as Youth Day celebrations were boycotted. The people of Ambazonia observed a complete shutdown of businesses, markets, and transportation on the 11th of February 2026 in protest of the Youth Day celebration organized by the French Cameroon administration. The lockdown, called by the Ambazonian government, was part of a civil disobedience campaign against French Cameroon's administration. Business premises were locked down, shops and different markets were closed, and means of transportation were grounded. There was no circulation of bikes, taxis, or private vehicles. The streets were early empty, with only a few people venturing out. The Ambazonian government had announced a 3-day lockdown to coincide with the Youth Day celebration, which they view as an attempt by French Cameroon to impose its authority on Ambazonians. The people of Ambazonia are distancing themselves from French Cameroon organized activities, asserting their independence and rejecting any attempt to be seen as part of French Cameroon. The boycott of the Youth Day celebration is a clear indication of the ongoing tensions between the Ambazonian people and the French Cameroon's administration. The Ambazonian government has consistently maintained that it will not participate in any activities organized by French Cameroon, and the people have shown their support for this stance by observing the lockdown. The situation remains tense, with the Ambazonian people determined to assert their rights and freedoms. The international community is watching closely, and there are concerns about the humanitarian situation in Ambazonia. Also, talking about the February 11th lockdown across Ambazonia, reports from various local sources indicates that the February 11th lockdown and school boycott called by the Ambazonian State Army and Ambazonian government was widely observed across several areas, stretching from Manyo in the southwest to Donga Mountain in the northwest side of Ambazonia. Well, according to community accounts and local observers, businesses remain closed and streets were largely deserted in many towns in what is commonly referred to as a ghost town operation. The lockdown, which coincided with Cameroon's National Youth Day celebration, is part of the ongoing efforts by Ambazonian forces seeking to assert the claims for their state of Ambazonia. In Manyo Division, residents reported minimal movement throughout the day, with commercial activities suspended and public transportation largely absent. Similar scenes were described in parts of Meme, Indian, and Fako. Moving northward, reports from divisions including Bui, Menchum, and Donga Manchun also suggested significant compliance with the boycott. In several localities, schools remained closed and public gatherings associated with Youth Day celebrations were reportedly not held. However, there were indications of partial activities in certain urban centers, such as Nkabe and parts of Limbe, where some businesses and individuals were said to have maintained limited operation. The level of compliance appeared to vary depending on security presence and local dynamics. Government authorities had not issued an immediate comprehensive statement on the extent of observance at the time of reporting. In previous instances, officials have maintained that public lives continued in many parts of Ambazonia despite calls for lockdown. The crisis in Ambazonia is now in its 9th year. What began in 2016 with protests by lawyers and teachers over marginalization, the situation has escalated into an armed conflict between the Ambazonian State Army and government forces, leading to prolonged instability, displacement of civilians, and periodic shutdowns of schools and businesses. The February 11th boycott reflects continuing tensions in the territory, where competing narratives persist between Ambazonian groups advocating for independence and the government, which maintains the country's territorial integrity. Further independent verification of conditions across all affected areas remains limited due to security constraints and restricted access to some localities. Heading into neighboring French Cameroon, Cameroonian main opposition party, the Social Democratic Front, has accused senior figures within the ruling Cameroon's People Democratic Movement of collaborating with armed separatist fighters in the country's Ambazonia to manipulate the outcome of the October 2025 presidential election. Now, in a resolution adopted during its National Executive Committee meeting on the 7th of February, the SDF alleged that the election was marred by massive fraud nationwide, with particular irregularities reported in the Northwest and Southwest, in what they say is the Northwest and Southwest, the Anglophone areas in their terms. They said it was engulfed in armed conflicts, with separatists seeking independence with what they call Ambazonia. Now, according to the SDF, the security situation in the two areas severely restricted voter participation as lockdowns, threats from armed groups, and ongoing clashes kept many residents away from polling stations. Despite this, official result released by the Constitutional Council on the 27th of October indicated high turnout figures in several divisions and overwhelming support for the incumbent President Paul Biya. President Biya, who is 93 years, was declared the winner with 53% of the votes, securing another term in office. However, opposition voices and segments of civil society have questioned the credibility of the results, arguing that the figures do not reflect realities on the ground, particularly in conflict-affected areas. The SDF presidential candidate Joshua Osei officially garnered 90% of the votes, 0.90% of the votes, placing sixth among 12 candidates. The party's latest resolution suggests that the results from the Ambazonian areas were artificially inflated to bolster the incumbent's tally. In a controversial claim, the SDF accused certain CPDM elites of striking covert arrangements with armed groups to facilitate ballot stuffing in areas where actual voter turnout was reportedly minimal. The party did not provide detailed evidence but called for an independent investigation into the conduct of the election. But here is the thing. Political observers note that the so-called separatist group had previously declared boycotts of national election, insisting that no voting would take place in the Ambazonian areas. Throughout the campaign period, separatist leaders reiterated that the presidential election was not relevant to the struggle for independence. Now, this has fueled skepticism among some residents and analysts over how significant vote counts were recorded in several localities. Supporters of this cause argue that linking Ambazonian fighters to election fraud is an attempt to discredit their movement and shift attention from the electoral malpractice by state actors. Ambazonians made it clear that the election did not concern them. Blaming them for ballot stuffing is a strategy to tarnish the image of the struggle, simply put. Now, the government has consistently maintained that the election was conducted in accordance with the law and the security forces ensured voting took place across the national territories. Meanwhile, authorities have yet to issue an official response to the SDF's latest allegation. French Cameroon's electoral process has long been a source of contention between the ruling CPDM, which has been in power for over 4 decades, and opposition parties that have repeatedly called for reforms to the electoral system, including the restructuring of elections, Cameroon's ALECAM, and the Constitutional Council. As tensions remain high in the Ambazonian area, the SDF accusations are likely to deepen political divisions and ignite debate over the credibility of Cameroon's democratic institutions. Calls from civil society groups for transparency, accountability, and dialogue, while it continues to grow concerns and the protracted conflicts in the Ambazonian areas. All right, that's all we have for you from news across the globe. And right after the break, we'll head into the African scene where Zimbabwe erupts over cabinet move to extend Mnangagwa's rule to 2030. Political tensions are rising in Zimbabwe after the cabinet approved proposed constitutional amendments that could extend President Emmerson Mnangagwa's tenure until 2030, sparking outrage from opposition parties and civil society groups. The 83-year-old president is currently serving his second and final term, which is set to end in 2028 under Zimbabwe's existing constitutional term limits. The newly approved amendment, however, could pave the way for an extension of his rule by altering key positions governing presidential terms and electoral processes. The proposed changes are expected to be introduced in Parliament in the coming weeks, with the ruling ZANU-PF party holding a commanding majority in both the National Assembly and Senate. The amendments are widely anticipated to pass legislative hurdles. Critics argue that the parliamentary arithmetic heavily favors the governing party, raising concerns about the likelihood of meaningful debate or resistance within the legislature. Opposition leaders have strongly condemned the move, describing it as an attempt to undermine constitutional democracy and entrench executive power. They argue that any amendments with the effect of extending a sitting president's term should be subjected to a national referendum rather than decided solely through Parliament. Legal analysts aligned with the opposition maintain that bypassing a referendum could weaken the legitimacy of the constitutional framework adopted in 2013. Civil society organizations have also raised alarm, warning that altering term limits risks reversing democratic gains and setting a precedent for indefinite rule. Some groups have begun mobilizing public awareness campaigns. While calls for peaceful protests are growing amid heightened political tensions, the government has defended the proposed amendments as part of broader constitutional reforms aimed at ensuring policy continuity and political stability. Officials argue that the longer terms could allow the administration to complete development programs tied to its long-term economic visions. The development comes at a time when Zimbabwe continues to grapple with economic challenges, including high unemployment, currency instability, and rising public dissatisfaction. Analysts say the constitutional debate is likely to intensify political polarization ahead of the 2028 elections. Regional and international observers are expected to closely monitor the parliamentary process as concerns mount over the potential implications for governance, democratic norms, and political stability in Southern African nation. Now let's get the news across the globe. The World Health Organization has renewed its call for the United States to share any intelligence it holds on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, even after Washington's formal withdrawal from the UN Health Agency. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said the organization has not received any origin-related intelligence from the U.S. authorities, despite publicly stating claims that the information exists. The agency had written to senior U.S. officials several months ago, requesting that any relevant intelligence be shared to help advance its ongoing investigation. The origin of SARS-CoV-2, first detected in Wuhan, China in late 2019, remains unresolved. Determining how the virus first entered the human population is considered crucial for preventing future pandemics. Competing theories include natural spillover from animals to humans and a possible laboratory-related incidents. WHO-led investigations have so far been inconclusive, and the agency maintains that all hypotheses remains under consideration pending further evidence. The renewed appeal follows the completion of the United States withdrawal from the WHO. On his first day back in office in January 2025, President Donald Trump initiated the one-year withdrawal process, citing dissatisfaction with the organization's handling of the pandemic. His administration has formally supported the theory that the virus may have originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, a claim that Beijing has rejected. Maria Van Kerkhove, the WHO's Epidemic and Pandemic Threat Management Chief, said the organization continues to seek information from all governments that have indicated they possess intelligence related to the pandemic origins, including the United States. To date, only information already available in the public domain has been reviewed. As the withdrawal period ended on the 22nd of January, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. issued a joint statement criticizing the WHO's, accusing it of obstructing the timely and accurate sharing of critical information during the pandemic and undermining U.S. contributions. The WHO disputed those claims. Although the WHO Constitution does not contain a specific withdrawal clause, the United States reserved the right to withdraw when it joined the organization in 1948, provided it gave 1 year's notice and met its financial obligation. WHO data, the United States has not paid its assessed contributions for 2024 and 2025, leaving approximately $260 million in outstanding dues. Despite the diplomatic tensions, WHO officials stressed that resolving the origins of COVID-19 remains a scientific priority. The agency continues to urge all governments to share any relevant information that could help reach a definitive conclusion and strengthen global preparedness against future health crises. That's it for tonight's Undaunted. But before we go, let's take a look at the news that made it to the headlines. Tonight on Undaunted, we told you that Atong Ignatius was killed in Kedjom, Ketinguh by his abductors after family failed to raise 5 million ransom on time. Also tonight, Ambazonia's Observance lockdown and 2-day celebrations are boycotted. Meanwhile, widespread observance reported in the February 11 lockdown across Ambazonia, while SDF accuses CPDM elites of colluding with armed groups to rig 2025 presidential election. While in Zimbabwe erupts over cabinet's move to extend Mnangagwa's road to 2030, while across the globe, WHO presses US to share COVID-19 origins intelligence after withdrawal in Geneva. That's it for tonight Undaunted. Bringing to the news on Church Stories. Sincerest apologies that Barrister Mbeseha could not join us due to some technical hitches. But on behalf of the technical crew behind tonight's production, it's good night and God bless.